There is a specific kind of man who owns both a car and a motorcycle. And the interesting thing is not that he owns them, it is the way he moves between them. On a Thursday, he's in the car, windows up, completely in his head, processing the week. On a Saturday morning, he's on the bike, helmet down, everything else gone. He's not performing a different mood. Something measurably different is happening inside his brain. And when you look at what psychology and neuroscience actually say about men drawn to both, the picture that emerges is not what most people expect. That difference is worth examining because the two vehicles were never really about transportation. They were about two completely different psychological needs living inside the same man. And the science of how those needs get met is more precise than anyone talks about. When a man switches from his car to his motorcycle, he's not just switching vehicles. Researchers studying rider neurology found that motorcycling produces a measurable decrease in alpha brainwave power and an increase in something called mismatch negativity, a response that heightens the brain's passive monitoring of changes in the environment. The car brain is analytical and detached. The motorcycle brain is raw and fully present. These men have not found two hobbies. They have trained themselves to operate in two distinct cognitive states on demand. That is not something most men ever build. Most men move through life in a single cognitive gear, one default mode for processing stress, one relationship with risk, one version of themselves available on any given day. There's nothing wrong with that. But men who are drawn to both a car and a motorcycle made a different decision at some point, consciously or not. Research on vehicle preferences found that these men score high on what psychologists call novelty seeking, a neurobiological disposition, not a lifestyle preference. Over 70% of motorcycle riders tested high on this trait. Their brain chemistry is literally wired to need new forms of stimulation. The car satisfies one dimension of that need. The motorcycle satisfies a completely different one. That is not indecision. That is a more complex psychological architecture than most men ever develop. Here is a number that should be in every wellness conversation but never is. Research on motorcycle riding found a 28% drop in cortisol, the primary stress hormone, during riding. That is a bigger reduction than most popular wellness habits produce. But the mechanism matters. The proposed explanation is not that riding is relaxing, it is that the intense concentration required leaves almost no room for ruminating on everyday problems. Unlike sitting meditation, you do not try to be present. The bike forces it. Men who ride motorcycles alongside driving cars have stumbled onto a dual-vehicle stress management system that most psychologists have not even studied. They're not doing it intentionally. They fell into it. This builds a quality that looks from the outside like excess. 2 vehicles, 2 sets of gear, 2 insurance payments. People assume it's about status or an inability to choose, but research tells a different story. Studies found that cars affirm men's sense of control, a symbolic embodiment of status and social performance. The car is a stage. You are visible in it. Your choices are legible to others. But on a motorcycle, all of that disappears. You cannot perform for anyone while managing a 200-kilogram machine in traffic. The motorcycle strips the ego down and demands pure presence. Men who love both are drawn to performing their identity in one vehicle and completely escaping it in the other. Research on social identity confirms this. These men are not confused. They are operating with 2 fully realized self-concepts, switching between them fluidly. That is a richer, more layered identity than single-vehicle men ever build. If you think that split, the car as performance, the motorcycle as escape, maps onto how you actually experience both, comment 1. If you think it's more complicated than that, comment 0. Either way, I want to know where you stand. Now, consider where this behavior comes from. Very few men arrive at both vehicles by accident. There was usually someone, a father who kept a bike in the back of the garage alongside the family car and said almost nothing about it but handed over the keys one afternoon and waited. An older man who rode and drove and never felt the need to explain why. There was no curriculum. What was being transmitted was not mechanical knowledge, it was a relationship to two different kinds of experience, the controlled and the raw, the legible and the instinctive. That transmission does not happen through explanation, it happens through presence, and when a man receives it, it becomes part of how he understands himself in ways that last long after the person who gave it is gone. This is why the attachment to both becomes identity, not just preference. Researchers studying the psychology of motorcycling describe it as serious leisure, a domain of personal involvement, self-improvement, accomplishment, and identification. That is not the language researchers use to describe a hobby. That is the language of self-concept. Scientists have also linked vehicle preferences to something called life history theory, an evolutionary framework for how people allocate energy across different life tasks. Men who love both may be running a more complex version of this strategy than most, using the car for status and social signaling in one context, using the motorcycle for raw experience and psychological reset in another. The first real challenge a man conquered on a bike is remembered with a specificity that had nothing to do with the ride itself, it was what it proved. This is where people misread men who operate this way. They see the two vehicles and assume it is about spending, about toys, about excess, but underneath something else is operating. These men have built two independent pathways into what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls flow, the state of complete absorption that is one of the most sought-after conditions in human performance research. The car produces it under specific conditions, the motorcycle produces it almost by design. And beyond flow, regular motorcycle riding develops sharper passive threat detection. The brain's mismatch response trains them to unconsciously monitor changes in the environment at a level that car driving alone never produces. Their perception of risk and surroundings is measurably different. That is not a personality quirk, that is a trained neurological advantage. And right now, research shows that more than 3/4 of young men who are struggling mentally do not believe they need help and are not seeking it. They are isolated in a way that earlier generations were not. They were handed a digital world not designed for their development, designed for engagement. The result is a generation with access to more stimulation than any before them and less access to the specific thing that builds psychological stability, real risk, embodied consequence, a problem that surrenders to their own hands. A therapist who rides described how a 3-day motorcycle trip helped him conquer fears that had nothing to do with riding. The riding calmed his nervous system and allowed him to transfer that same presence into other areas of his life. Men who ride and drive are, without knowing it, running a psychological exposure loop. The car teaches control. The motorcycle teaches courage. Together, they build something that no app, no retreat, and no subscription can replicate. The question is not whether you own a motorcycle or an enthusiast car. The question is whether you have built any context in your life where the feedback is honest, where two genuinely different versions of you are available on demand, where one environment strips everything down and another lets you reconstruct it. Because the men who have that, whether they found it in a garage, on a road, in a sport, or anywhere else where the world gives a clear answer, carry something into every other area of their life that cannot be downloaded. A refusal to collapse under a single mode of being, a quiet knowledge that they can shift, that they have more than one version of themselves available, and both are capable. It was never really about the vehicles, it was about what kind of man is drawn to both the controlled and the untamed, the visible and the silent, the performance and the escape from it. That duality in one person is not a contradiction, it is an answer to a question most men never think to ask about themselves.